The Gonzaga Bulldogs offered a scholarship to the top-ranked center in the 2026 recruiting class. Could he be Chet Holmgren 2.0 in Spokane?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster, and they do it for free. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. Happy Monday, folks. It is a mailbag episode today. Not a ton of questions asked, but we're going to get to those in the second and third segments of today's show. We got questions about Mark Few's rotation. We got questions about the pair of Zags who were selected in the 2024 WNBA draft. We'll get to those. But first, want to lead the show talking about the latest recruit the Zags have officially made a scholarship offer to. That would be 2026 center Sam Funches. And this is, by my count, the first 2026 player Gonzaga has made an offer to. They have a handful of recruits they are pursuing in the 2025 class, like Isaiah Harwell and Nick Kamenia, and a handful of others. But 2026, it's a long ways away. We're still just in the early stages of being able to recruit at that level. So not a surprise that we haven't heard or talked a ton about that. And at this point, players who are getting offers for a class that is that far away are typically the best of the best. And that is the case here with Sam Funches. He's a 6'10" center from Madison, Missouri. He's the 13th ranked player in the class of 2026, according to On3's composite rankings. He's the top-ranked center everywhere, and he's number 8 at 24/7's individual rankings. And then I think ESPN and Rivals and On3 all have him right around 20. So he's a top 20 prospect-ish in that class right now. Again, these rankings are going to change a whole bunch when we're talking about high school juniors, like the incoming, about to be high school juniors. So there's still a lot of development, a lot of growth still to be done, but obviously a young man that there's a lot of excitement about. We saw the post on social media, on Twitter, that he'd received an offer from Gonzaga. I think it was RJ Barsh who'd been out recruiting him out in Missouri. His Twitter account then, I think, got suspended or disappeared. And anyway, the post is back on Instagram. It's on Twitter. It's clear that Gonzaga is one of the schools that has made an offer to this young man. And again, we're talking about a 16-year-old, so there's a lot that's going to change about his game between now and when he becomes a college player, and then even beyond that. But what we know right now is he's 6'10". He's really long. He's really rangy. He's got a huge wingspan. He's an impactful shot blocker. Most 6'10", 16-year-olds who have a long wingspan are going to be impactful shot blockers. He's also demonstrated the ability to step out and knock down open three-point shots. He's also a very good low post scorer, but the appeal right now, the reason that he's ranked so highly in his class, why Gonzaga and so many others, we'll get to that in a second, are showing interest, is because he looks like the kind of player who could be that really impactful unicorn archetype, the Chet Holmgren mold. I mean, that's what it is. You're tall, you're skinny, you can score around the rim, you can shoot three-pointers, and you can block shots. Obviously, if you add in ball handling skills and various other things, that's when you get to like the real full Chet Holmgren package. But for Sam Funches at his age to have shown at least the ability to potentially turn into that kind of player, that's going to vault you up those lists. That's going to get you a ton of attention recruiting-wise. And it's why Gonzaga is interested, because they want that kind of player. Who doesn't want that kind of player? I'll tell you right now, the Zags are a little late to the party here. He already has offers from a ton of places, and he's got a lot of offers from places that are much closer to home in the Missouri area than where Gonzaga is right now, of course. Offers, this isn't even a full list, but I'm just going to read this list of schools that have made official offers to Sam Funches already. Ole Miss, Alabama, Auburn, Kansas State, Mississippi State, Creighton, Texas A&M, Indiana, Houston, Florida State, North Carolina State, Michigan, LSU, Georgia, Georgia Tech, and Arkansas. So basically every school in the SEC, a handful of great Big Ten programs, big #1 seed in the Houston Cougars. Like, there is just about a little bit of everything on this list of schools that have reached out, not just reached out, mind you, straight up offered for Sam Funches at this point. Now, in terms of where he's going to potentially end up, it's way too early to know. I say Gonzaga is late to the party, but it's not late for a 2026 player at this point. It's not late. Doesn't mean that they're going to get him necessarily, just means that they're in the mix along with everybody else. Now, what we do know is that he keeps going to Ole Miss. He's visited Ole Miss multiple times. That seems like the front runner right now. He spoke recently about one of his visits to them last season. They didn't win the game. He said, I like, the fight that they showed, the adversity, et cetera, et cetera. We know Chris Beard is a very good recruiter. That's always been a strength of his. I think certainly Chris Beard needs to stay at Ole Miss for the next couple of years if they want to actually land Sam Funches. I could certainly see a situation where he ultimately commits to Ole Miss. But if in a few years, obviously we already saw some huge job openings this offseason with Arkansas and, of course, Kentucky and USC and various others. But Chris Beard is probably not going to last a whole lot longer at Ole Miss if he keeps having success the further he gets removed from his legal issues from his final season at Texas. Not saying I agree necessarily with that, just saying that that's probably the reality here is another good year or 2 good years at Ole Miss, and Chris Beard's probably getting another bigger job depending on what ends up opening up. But that right now feels like the front runner school for Sam Funches. On3 has them as 43% odds, for 43% chance of landing him, followed by Alabama at about 20% and Auburn at about 17%. And again, a whole bunch of other schools on there, but Gonzaga's got a sales pitch here. Look what they've done with Chet Holmgren. I know that some people think he was utilized incorrectly at Gonzaga, and I think there's an argument to be had there. But if you're Sam Funches and you know what your skill set is, and you want to go somewhere that's going to capitalize on that, you could do a whole heck of a lot worse than Gonzaga. So I can see why they're in the mix here and certainly hope that he will give them some strong consideration. And it's just a good sign for Gonzaga that they're in the mix here, that they're putting their name out there. People were concerned about how little they recruited in the 23 and 24 recruiting classes. Part of that was just roster construction. And I think a lot of times there's this panic when Gonzaga doesn't make a bunch of offers or when they're not doing so-and-so in the recruiting and transfer portal. And you have to understand that there's a lot of navigating that has to be done. And you're navigating on assumptions in the modern era of college basketball. You're assuming the players who said they've committed to your program are going to come to your program. You're assuming the players who have not entered the transfer portal are going to remain not entering the transfer portal. You're assuming that the players who are testing out the NBA draft waters are or not coming back. I don't know. It kind of depends on what you're 50-50 there. You're kind of guessing. But for Mark Few and the Zags, they've had to operate on a lot of assumptions lately, which is part of the reason that we saw pretty weak or just not a lot of volume of players in these classes. There's still nobody in that 2024 recruiting class. We know Gonzaga pursued Trent Perry after he decommitted from USC. We know they're currently pursuing Nolan Traore, who I think is unlikely to even play college basketball, but they are pursuing him. Trent Perry, it sounds like, is going to go to Virginia. That's what we're hearing right now. That's an unfortunate that he's not coming to Gonzaga. I think he'd have been a really nice fit there, but they're still involved. They're still looking to make some of those additions. We like that they're making a move for a center in the 26 class because that's when we know that, Ben Gregg will be gone. Graham Ike's got 2 years of eligibility left. So after that 26 season, he'll be gone. Braden Huff's obviously got a lot of years left, but you need some more depth outside of that. So pursuing a player like Funches makes a lot of sense. And we know that they got a lot of targets in the 2025 class as well. As of right now, they're still pursuing Isaiah Harwell, who's a top 10 player in that 25 class, 6'6" combo guard from Pocatello, Idaho. We know they're pursuing Nick Kaminia out of Harvard Westlake High School, the same high school as Trent Perry, mind you. We know they're pursuing guys like Julius Halifanoa and a handful of others, Jalen Harrelson, in that 2025 class. So haven't seen a lot of commits lately. Wouldn't expect one from Sam Funches. Maybe not at all for Gonzaga, but certainly not anytime soon, as he's still so young and still early into his high school career. But hoping we'll see some updates on that 25 class soon, and maybe Gonzaga can make a push for somebody in 2024 as well. We're going to move into the mailbag portion of the show. Will Mark Few open up his rotation next season? That's a common question. We're going to talk about it. We're going to discuss that and a few more things all coming up after a word from today's sponsor, LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, folks, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, which has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster, and they do it for free. And thankfully, LinkedIn is not just another job board. They have a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, making it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals that you cannot find anywhere else. And LinkedIn does all that while making the process both easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and they may not have the time or the resources to hire. So they're constantly finding ways to make that process even easier. For example, they just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, folks, segment 2, still Eddie Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're switching over to Mailbag Monday for the final 2 segments of the show. Got a handful of questions from my guy Jeff via Gmail. We're going to answer 3 of those questions here in the second segment, get to some more questions to close out the show. Jeff asks, what sort of chance do you think there is that 9 guys regularly play significant minutes during the 24-25 season? Could the 2024-25 team defy Mark Few's usual trends and see 9 guys play significant minutes the way the 2016-17 team did? Yeah, I don't see it. I don't see it with the way the roster is currently constructed. For starters, as you alluded to in your question, I cut parts of it out, but effectively, Mark Few very, very rarely plays a 9-man rotation. He did in that 2016-17 team, but they had 7 NBA players on that roster, and it made more sense with the personnel that they had to do that. I don't see a 9-man rotation materializing on this team as the roster is currently constructed. If they make future additions, perhaps that will change the equation. Here's where the cutoff is. The cutoff right now is Luka Krajinovic. Here are the 8 guys ahead of Luka Krajinovic in the rotation by my count. You have Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman, who are both going to play somewhere between 32 and 35 minutes per game. I don't see their playing time dropping significantly. I think it should drop a little bit. I think it should probably drop a little bit more than Mark Few is going to be willing to drop it, but it's not going to drop much. Ryan Nembhard's played over 33 minutes per game every single year of his career. It's not going to change dramatically as a senior. You have Michael Ajayi stepping into a role as a starting small forward, most likely. I think he plays 25 to 30 minutes per game. Ben Gregg is probably in that 25, 28-ish minutes per game as the power forward. Graham Ike, 25 to 28 minutes. I think they'd like to play him more, but he's going to end up averaging closer to 25 because of foul trouble and just not being a guy who you're going to ride out there for 35, 38 minutes per game, most likely. So that's your starting 5 projected. Coming off the bench, Steele Venters and Dusty Stromer are both going to play, I think, 15 to 20 minute per game roles as your 2 3s. I think there's the potential for Ajayi to play some small ball 4. I think that, again, with Hickman and Nembhard both being point guards, or at least capable of playing the point guard position, you're going to see some of Dusty Stromer and Steele Venters at the 2, with one of those guys playing the 1 and the other one sitting. Because of that, I don't think that creates a lot of consistent playing time for Luka Krajinovic. If Luka Krajinovic develops dramatically over the offseason, which could totally happen. I spoke about it on Friday's show. It was the Luka Krajinovic season in review episode. Go check it out if you have not done so yet. I think that he could carve out a role if he really develops. But ultimately, my projection is that the 8 players we named, I forgot to mention Braden Huff, he would play 18 to 20 minutes basically whenever Graham Ike is not playing. Those 8 guys are going to be a rotation. And if all those guys are playing 15 plus minutes per game, there's just not a lot of minutes left. Krajinovic to me is the cutoff. I think he plays 8 to 10 minutes a game, but I think it's not every night. I think some nights he doesn't play. It's going to look a lot like last year without the, missing 6 weeks in the middle of the season with the hand injury, hopefully. But I just don't see him playing. Like, maybe he plays 5 to 6 minutes most nights. And some games it's 0, some games it's 12 minutes, but it's not super consistent. That's my guess for how it's going to shake out for Krajinovic. I don't see Yo carving out a big role. He didn't look all that great this year and didn't do anything to demonstrate that he's going to Like he'd have to make dramatic improvements to be a rotation player this year. So I think Krajinovic just outside the rotation. I think Yo's just outside the rotation. Pavle Stosic and the walk-ons, those guys are not in the rotation. So I think you're set at the 8 that you have now, with Krajinovic kind of being that hinge in terms of potentially being a 9-man rotation or not. But my gut says we're going to see pretty consistently 8 guys playing night in and night out. And eventually in specific games, it could just be 7, and that'll be a battle between Venters and Stromer for who's going to be kind of that 7th person. Next questions, I'm going to lump these two together, both from Jeff here. He says, just like the 16-17 and 2020-21 teams, the 24-25 Gonzaga team is going to have 8 or 9 guys on the roster who have been playing together for multiple years. What chance do you think this team has at repeating the type of success of those other 2 teams? And then he follows that up by saying, kind of a fun question. Gonzaga went to the Final Four in 17 and 21. What do you think the chances are that Gonzaga could make the 2025 Final Four and create a trend of Gonzaga making the Final Four every 4 years? The continuity helps. And I think there is an element of overvaluing continuity in the modern college basketball game. And I don't like making this comparison because I don't think this is going to be how Gonzaga's season goes. But I have said this on the podcast before, and I will say it again. AP voters right now are trying to figure out how in the heck to rank 25 teams when 15 or 18 of them have completely overhauled their roster. 5 or 6 of them have a lot of continuity. A few of them are all freshmen. It's really hard. And we see a lot of people just rely on rosters that have continuity. We saw last year with Michigan State getting ranked in the top 5, despite not being a very good team the year prior. And then guess what? Michigan State was pretty bad last year for most of the season, still snuck into the tournament because it's Tom Izzo, but they weren't very good. 2 years ago, it was North Carolina. They were, as an 8 seed, made a miracle run to the national championship game, returned everybody except one key starter who they replaced in the transfer portal. It's a lot like Gonzaga, except without the national championship run. That Carolina team was preseason number 1 and became the first preseason number 1 team ever to not make the NCAA tournament. That's 2 very prominent examples of teams getting overseeded overranked the next year because of continuity. Again, I don't think that's necessarily the trajectory that this Gonzaga season is going to go on. It is just an acknowledgement that using continuity as an example of why this team's going to succeed it's not always the case. Teams that have won, like UConn replaced a bunch of starters and they won back-to-back national championships. They did it without Adama Sanogo and without Naheem Aline or Jordan Hawkins or Joey Calcaterra or all those guys who were out the door. Yeah, they had continuity, guys like Alex Caravan coming back, Donovan Clingan coming back, but key parts of their team that won the championship this year were new, like Cam Spencer, who they had in the transfer portal, like Stephon Castle, who was a recruit. Like, it's not always going to be cut and dry in that regard. In terms of comparing this upcoming Gonzaga team to those 2 teams that have gone to the national championship, those 2 teams had NBA caliber players on their team. They both had lottery picks. I don't see that with this Gonzaga team. This Gonzaga team does not have a Jalen Suggs on it. This Gonzaga team does not have a Zach Collins on it. I think Braden Huff's fairly similar to Zach Collins, but I don't see him getting drafted coming off the bench this year. Like that, it could happen. I'm not going to pretend it's impossible to happen. He'd have to make some significant strides defensively, although I expect that he will. But ultimately, I just don't see this team being, like, again, that 16-17 team, I think had 7 guys who ended up playing in the NBA. I'm not sure. I'm pretty confident there's not 7 guys on this Gonzaga roster who are going to play in the NBA. There's maybe a few, but I don't think the talent is just not quite as much there. And a lot of the guys who are on this team are good college players who aren't going to be NBA players because of the modern NBA, like Graham Ike, like Ryan Nembhard, like Nolan Hickman. I just don't see those guys being NBA players because of their size. In Ike's case, because he's just not a modern big, the way that Drew Timmy's not a modern big. But ultimately, I don't think this Gonzaga team is as deep as those 16-17 and 2020-21 teams, which is less of a knock on this current Gonzaga team and more of like those were 2 of the best rosters ever assembled in college. They lost 3 games combined in those 2 seasons, and 2 of those 3 games were literally national championship games. So those 2 teams are just absolutely unbelievably stacked. I also think this team's not as good defensively. And I think if you wanted to nitpick a specific area outside of just the general, they don't have lottery picks on the roster type conversation, defensively, I don't really see it. That 16-17 team was so good defensively. Perkins and Williams-Goss is a great backcourt on that team. You had Jordan Matthews, who was a hard-nosed player. You had Jonathan Williams and Shema Karnowski and Zach Collins and Killian Tilly, who were all good defensive players. And I don't think that this team is quite on that level. They don't have as much rim protection. They don't have as much perimeter defense. Replacing Anton Watson is going to be a challenge for them defensively. So I think that that's an area where this team is not as good as those two teams, and we'll need to find ways to improve, whether it's schematically, whether there's some personnel jumps that happen, whatever it may be. But I think that that's kind of an area that this team is not quite on that same level as those two national championship programs for Markview. Well, is Washington State going to bring another bid to the WCC next season? We got that and more. But first, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, FanDuel. Folks, it is playoff time right now in the NBA and NHL. Baseball is in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. So bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And folks, right now, if you're getting ahead of the game, Gonzaga has plus 2,500 odds to win it all in 2025. Folks, it's already dropped. It was at plus 3,000. Now it's at plus 2,500. You want to maximize those odds? Throw some money down by visiting FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic W. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, closing out the show with some more Mailbag Monday questions here. This one comes from @BD Brownie on Discord, who says, ever since Kyle Smith moved on and all the WSU players started entering the transfer portal, my Coug friends have been very pessimistic about the future of their team. I've been trying to steer them into the positive outlook that I see for them in the near future. Wells and Watts could very well be top 15 players in the WCC. Maybe Jakimovsky returns. Maybe Cedric Coward transfers from Eastern. They've got a chance to have a legitimately solid team. I know there's still a lot to be determined about Washington State's roster, but with the WCC maybe having a chance to get back to being a 3-bid league, do you see the Cougs as having a good chance of being a top 3 WCC team and having a chance to get back to the tournament? Well, a couple updates to this question. It was asked about 4 or 5 days ago on Discord, so I haven't gotten a chance to get to it yet. Jakimovsky just transferred to Colorado as I'm recording this on Sunday evening. That was announced just a few hours ago, so he is not in the mix for Washington State. And then the two players from Eastern Washington, two of their best transfers who have entered the portal, Cedric Coward and Dane Erikstrup, they have yet to commit to Washington State. Doesn't mean they won't. They just haven't done it yet. However, Lawan Watts, as mentioned in the question, he's a solid player. 6'6" wing. He averaged 10 and 5 last year as a freshman at Eastern Washington. Is he ready to take on a big role right away? Because everybody's gone for Wazoo. Like new coach David Riley, he doesn't have much of a roster right now. So I think there's a good chance that somebody like Lawan Watts steps into a big role right away. And again, he was very productive as a true freshman at Eastern Washington, but we have to see whether he can take that sophomore leap or not. Ethan Price was another big addition coming over from Cheney to Pullman. He's a rising senior. Last year as a junior, he averaged 12 points, 4 boards, and 2.5 assists. He was very efficient, about 62.5% on 2-pointers and about 37.5% from 3. 6'10" player who averaged in double figures, who shot 37% from 3 and 62% on 2s. Folks, that's going to play. That's going to play just fine in the WCC. I think Ethan Price is going to be a big-time addition for David Riley and the Cougs, and I think he's going to be very, very possibly be in that all-WCC conversation. But here's the thing. It's too early to know because they have like a quarter of a roster right now, and some of the players who have come in are pretty good. From Eastern Washington, some of these guys are good, but they've lost a ton of talent. Isaac Jones out the door, Miles Rice out the door. He transfers to Indiana. Like they had one of their big men transferred to Florida. We just found that out. Like they're pretty decimated right now, and it's unfortunate that this move happened in the transfer portal era where players can leave as much as they want, and we've seen that with most rosters where coaches ended up leaving, is that pretty much the entire team follows suit. And for players who were in the Pac-12 and are now going to the WCC, I can understand why they might not necessarily want to stay. It's unfortunate. I love the WCC. I think that Washington State could be a really big-time player in the WCC, and this could be really good for their brand. But a lot of players are choosing to jump ship and find another place to go, and I don't really blame them for doing that. I understand. But right now, it's too early to know. It depends who else David Riley adds. It depends what that schedule looks like. They need to put together, like, in order to make the NCAA tournament as an at-large in the WCC, you need to have a strong non-conference schedule. You need to win big games. Can Washington State schedule big games after moving to the WCC? how much is that going to impact them? I think that's a huge part of the storyline for them and for Oregon State. Obviously, Oregon State's got a much more difficult path to being an NCAA tournament at-large team at all. Like they're very unlikely to be in consideration for that. But Wazoo's coming off a 7 seed, coming off a good season. They're going to have some eyeballs on them. They're going to have a little bit of a narrative attention around them, but they have to schedule well. They have to win some of those non-conference games, and they got to have more than 4 or 5 players on their roster. So it's still way too early to tell. I'm optimistic that Wazoo can make this move to the WCC work to their advantage, and that, yes, in a high-end scenario, they can be a third at-large bid out of the WCC alongside Gonzaga and St. Mary's, who frankly has some work to do as well after losing Aiden Mahaney and Joshua Jefferson to the portal. But right now, it's just too early to tell. 2 more questions to close out the show, both coming from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, while the NBA is largely composed of first-round draft picks, that is even more true with the WNBA, where even several first-round WNBA picks struggle to make their rosters. How much of a chance do Brynna Maxwell and Kaylynne Truong have to actually be on their WNBA rosters when the season starts? Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I don't know the exact ins and outs. What I can tell you is from conversation I had with Brynna Maxwell last week on that episode, which went live on Thursday. The Sky needs shooting. They need floor spacing. They need outside shooting. And Brynna Maxwell provides that in a major way. That is why they drafted her. She is the second highest selected player in Gonzaga basketball history in the WNBA draft, behind, of course, Courtney Vandersloot, who was also selected by the Chicago Sky, also started her career in a high school career on the west side of Washington, also played at Gonzaga, also wore 22. A lot of similarities between those two right now. But I will say that Gonzaga has had 8 players selected in the WNBA draft historically, and only 2 of them have actually played in the WNBA. One of them is, of course, Courtney Vandersloot. The other one is Caitlin Redmond, who was a 3rd-round pick, I think in 2012, 2013. I can't remember the exact year. Regardless, Sloot was the only 1st-round pick. Kayla Sandish was a 2nd-round pick who did not make it who did not actually play in the WNBA. Redmond was a 3rd-round pick. So Maxwell and Truong are both 2nd-round picks. Again, Maxwell's 2nd highest selected player of all time. Truong is 4th, as Standish was the 19th pick. Truong was the 21st pick. But it just depends on the roster you end up on. I think the unfortunate thing for the WNBA is not only the lack of total teams. They're working on expansion, but there's still not enough teams in the WNBA right now. They also don't have a feeder league. So if you don't make it, you don't make it. And you get cut, and that's it. And you go play professionally overseas, and maybe you can make it back at training camps some other time. But it's a really hard league to stick. It's a really hard league to make it and stick on a roster. 25% of players drafted out of Gonzaga have made it have actually played a WNBA game. I'm optimistic more so about Maxwell than I am about Truong right now, from what I know about those 2 rosters, but it is not an easy path. Final question of the show comes from Jeff. It says, Kaylynne Truong suffered a pretty significant foot injury early in the 22-23 season, missed all but about 7 or 8 games. If she would have stayed healthy, what do you think the chances are that she would have been drafted? I don't really know. I mean, that's a tough question for me to answer. I don't know how she would have looked. I mean, I think she would have played well had she been healthy. I will say that Maxwell mentioned in the podcast that there was a lot of scouts at their games this season. I don't know how many scouts were at their games the previous season, but there were scouts watching them this year. And Kaylynne got selected and Kaylee did not. So I don't know how many of those scouts why she wasn't picked, if it had anything to do with her missing a majority of the previous season. My guess is probably not. I'm not saying it wasn't a factor at all. I'm sure it was related in some capacity, whether it was concern whether she would hold up or they did medicals on her and they decided it's too risky for us. But I don't think it plays a huge role in her not getting selected this year, because I think the majority of the attention that WNBA scouts put on this team happened this year and not the previous year. It's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Thank you so much to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We'll be back on Tuesday talking transfer portal, talking Mark Few coaching Team USA, talking all sorts of good stuff as we get into the week, and of course continuing our season in review series this week as well. Thanks for listening, and until next time, as always, go Zags.